week 6 of Project Value Delivery Strategy and Planning. And the title of this is Aligning Work, Resources, Metrics, and Scheduling in Project Planning. That we're going to focus on how planning decisions enable value delivery across the project lifecycle. So we'll start by framing project work as a system where we connect activities, resources, and outcomes rather than just a task list. So kind of the tendency in the past is to kind of treat project works as checking off tasks. And we're going to look at it from a little different perspective. It's sort of the modern look at this is, again, how we focus on how we connect everything together to deliver value. So from there, we're going to look at how project metrics are planned to support decision making and performance measurement. And then we'll shift to the sort of the people side, looking at how team culture, development, and leadership are planned intentionally within what's now called the resources performance domain. And so we'll focus on resource planning. We'll look at schedule planning. We'll look at these from a PMBOK 8 and 7 perspective. And what we're going to emphasize is integration, adaptability, and feasibility. And so we're going to walk through how project schedules are developed and as sort of an iterative cycle and rather than a set of linear steps. And then we'll compare how schedules are represented across predictive and adaptive delivery approaches. So we're going to, that'll help us highlight how the planning artifacts that we create are tailored to context while still supporting the value delivery goals of the project. So effective project execution depends on aligning work, people, schedules, and metrics to value delivery. And so this week we're going to approach project work and metrics and teams and scheduling from the planning perspective rather than, viewing them as isolated execution activities, if we mentioned. In both the 7 and 8 versions of the PMBOK, planning is positioned as a value-focused, decision-oriented process that establishes how work is going to be performed, measured, led, and sequenced to support our outcomes. It's sort of the view prior to PMBOK 7 was we were really focused on the triple constraints of, cost, schedule, scope, and maybe some quality and some other constraints. It's more about satisfying constraints than it was delivering value. We talked about project benefits prior, but PMBOK 7 kind of was the first shift of that from a PMI perspective. So effective project planning in this context aligns four critical elements. First, we have the project work needs to be planned in a way that connects activities to value and benefits. And then the metrics need to be planned up front to define how success, progress, and value realization will be assessed, not just tracked after the fact. And then third, team culture and leadership approaches are intentionally planned to support collaboration, accountability, and adaptability. And so this is most likely where we would make our decision on the life cycle approach, whether it's predictive, adaptive, or some hybrid. And then so finally, then the schedules will be developed as planning models that translate that strategic intent into coordinated timelines, and while we need to allow for or accommodate for uncertainty and change. And so all these decisions, these planning decisions establish our foundation for what I would call informed execution and continuous learning and then value delivery throughout the project life cycle. So we focused on scope planning. And then before that, we talked about, projects as a system, in project initiation, how we have the project charter and the stakeholder identification, how would those move into scope management planning and how to develop the scope. And so what we've done is we've established what the project will deliver and defines the boundaries for the project. And so we've answered the question in scope planning of what's intended in the project. And so now we're going to move from defining scope to the planning of the work required to realize that scope. So project work planning translates these deliverables that we've defined in the scope to activities and decisions that we can coordinate to enable value delivery. And so from a planning perspective, project work is not just a list of things to be completed. It's a means to enable value delivery, where we, by intentionally linking these activities to some kind of outcome or desired outcomes and benefits. And so this represents a shift away from activity management, which has kind of sort of been the focus of project management for a long time, towards outcome-oriented decision making, which is sort of central to project success. So during planning, we're going to define what work is necessary, and we're going to track how that work, or decide how that work contributes to value, and how we're going to coordinate it across all the different stakeholders. So well-defined work reduces uncertainty or ambiguity and supports realistic scheduling and estimating, and creates a shared understanding of the project priorities. And poorly planned work, on the other hand, or in contrast, leads to misalignment and rework and usually ineffective decisions during project execution. So the principles here from the project, the PMBOK, that we're looking at, they help us guide here, is the concept of adapting or adopting a holistic view. That's where we look at the interdependencies of scope, schedule, resources, and stakeholder. And we consider, we want to avoid this silo thinking. We want to focus on value, which ensures that the work is prioritized and based on its contribution to stakeholder outcomes. The next principle here is integrating sustainability. So we want sustainable projects. We want to encourage that we consider the long-term organizational, social, environmental, cultural impacts when we define the project work. So by planning to work with value in mind and with these principles, we, as project managers and project leaders, can establish a stable foundation that supports effective measurement, adaptive scheduling, and collaborative team performance throughout the project lifecycle. And so planning metrics enable, so the first thing is to set these metrics up. So the planning metrics early establishes informed decision-making and supports value delivery. So in project planning, we don't want to add metrics after the work begins or after we started planning. It's effective project teams plan metrics early. Metrics are the definitions of how we're going to measure what we're doing, how we define project progress, performance, and value delivery. And we're going to evaluate those things throughout the project lifecycle based on these metrics. And so what we can do there is we can ensure that the right information will be available when decisions need to be made, so we can track this through. So it's sort of it's an evidence-based approach managing or defining our outcomes. And so plan metrics help us to establish a shared understanding of what success looks like. So by defining these measures up front, things like outcome indicators, benefit realization targets, risk thresholds or risk appetite, the teams and the stakeholders, we can make informed trade-off decisions that are related to scope, schedule, costs, and resources. So without these metrics, projects can default to that activity tracking. And activity tracking is sort of a vanity metrics. They can look good, we're getting things done, but are we really delivering the outcomes that were expected? So we're not really, when we're doing that activity tracking, we're not really focused on value delivery. And so from a planning perspective, metrics are decision tools, measurement tools that help us understand what we're delivering and what changes we need to make. They're not just a vanity scorecard that we're keeping up with. So when metrics are planned early, they can help us set our priorities. They can highlight trade-offs that we're going to need to make to be successful. They can establish what success is going to look like before execution begin so we can get that shared understanding. And so without these planned metrics, we can lose sight of the value focused decision making. And also metrics support the other values of governance and transparency and adaptability. So these measures enables us to monitor project performance, helps us to identify emerging issues, helps us to adjust plans when conditions change, and metrics planned with value in mind reinforce accountability and help us to ensure that project work remains aligned with our intended outcomes. And so effective project metrics are planned by aligning measures to objectives, stakeholders, and success criteria. And so in planning, we need metrics are aligned with the project management system. And so the effective metrics planning begins by clearly understanding what our objectives are and what our critical success factors are. Metrics that are not tied to those project goals risk driving sort of wrong behaviors and providing little value when it comes to decision making that we need to make. Because we're going to come up with decisions that we need to make regarding activities that are going on in the schedule. So we need good information, good data for that. Stakeholder involvement at this point when we're creating these metrics is important because different stakeholders may have different value outcomes, and engaging them early in the process helps to ensure that the plan metrics are meaningful, trusted, and actionable. And so this stakeholder alignment also reduces the resistance and confusion once we start reporting on project performance. And so we should use what's called SMART criteria. And I don't know if you've heard of this before, but the acronym stands for our metrics should be specific. In other words, they need to be well written. They need to be measurable, so we need to be able to measure them. And they need to be achievable. So this needs to be something that we can achieve. And they need to be relevant and time bound. And that creates what's called a SMART metric. And that if we meet that kind of definition of what a SMART metric is, it's more likely we're going to be able to, one, if it's achievable, we have to be able to measure it. But then we get outcomes and they're time bound, and we're just not endlessly tracking something. So and then we want to establish baselines. Our baselines kind of reflect those SMART criteria during planning, which baselines are a reference point for evaluating future performance and value realization. So the metrics align with baselines, help us provide clarity, alignment, and they turn these metrics into reliable planning tools rather than just reactive reporting mechanisms. Using multiple categories of metrics enable holistic planning and better decision making. So no single metric can adequately represent the overall project health. So effective project planning requires a balanced set of metrics, each one of those serving a different decision-making purpose. So by planning multiple categories of metrics, project teams can gain more complete picture of how the project is expected to perform across time, cost, scope, quality, and risk, and stakeholder engagement in those kind of constraints that we've talked about. And schedule and cost metrics support realistic forecasting. Let me get started back here. We're talking about the different categories. And so, schedule and cost metrics support the realistic planning and forecasting, while scope and quality metrics ensure that the planned work aligns with our requirements and standards. And then we've got risk and efficiency metrics, which help us plan and anticipate uncertainty, and things like resource constraints and stakeholder engagement metrics help us to reinforce the importance of communication and expectation management. And so this approach reflects the sort of the modern project management view and emphasis on adopting a holistic view. It kind of fulfills that principle, that a holistic approach from the PMBOK guide. And so planning across multiple metrics categories helps prevent narrow decision making and enables trade-offs that are aligned with value delivery rather than isolated performance indicators. These are some example project metrics that illustrate how planning decisions are informed before execution begins. So uh, these are kind of common metrics that we see. So the purpose here is not to memorize formulas or anything, but to understand how these different types of metrics support different planning decisions. So for example, schedule and cost metrics help us assess feasibility and trade-offs. Scope and quality metrics ensure that planned work aligns with requirements and standards. Risk, efficiency, which I talked about earlier, previous slide, anticipate uncertainty and constraints. But the important thing here is that these metrics are defined during planning, not after we start executing, which is a sort of a tendency that we get into. Start planning, people start doing work, and then it just kind of gets away from us. And then we have no way to measure what we're doing and whether or not it works. And this concept kind of applies in all three different project management approaches. That we just have different ways of applying these concepts in each mostly between adaptive and predictive. But in the adaptive models, the agile models, you're going to define these metrics in terms of like working agreements, definition done, acceptance criteria, and then you're going to work with your same way we here work with your stakeholders to define outcomes, and then they're going to assess those outcomes on that definition. So you're not going to use all of these metrics in every project. Planning is all about kind of selecting the right measures for the right outcomes that we're looking for, and it's not just about collecting data. It's about collecting the right data for the right outcomes. A metrics plan, which is sort of a new idea, a metrics plan formulates how performance and value will be measured throughout the projects. So it's a formal planning artifact that translates our planning decisions, our metrics planning decisions, into some kind of structured approach, documented approach. So rather than relying just on ad hoc reporting, the metrics plan defines how measures will be used, how they'll be calculated, and how often they will be reviewed. And so, like in the scaled agile framework, that adaptive model, they have a whole set of metrics definitions that they're templates that you can just pull out and use those if you want, or you can adapt those. But they have these clearly defined measures in them that help you calculate what's going on. So from a planning perspective, the metrics plan supports governance by establishing sort of shared expectations among the project leaders, team members, and all the stakeholders. And it also helps to clarify ownership. Who's responsible for collecting, analyzing, and communicating the metric data. And it specifies the tools to ensure that we have consistency and reliability. So this is really fundamentally taking a scientific approach to how you measure what's going on. You define you have your question you're going to ask. What are we going to solve? What's the purpose of this? Then for each sort of work package, you define what's the hypothesis, how do we know that this work package is successful or not? And then what tools are we going to use to go back and validate all those at each point? All this is in alignment with all the project management principles, and especially the ones on transparency and adaptability. This helps to implement those principles. So by intentionally planning these measurements, we can detect things early. We can kind of do real-time trade-off analysis, and we can adjust as our conditions change, and to make sure that in that adjustment we can do to help us to make sure that work stays aligned with the value that we're trying to deliver throughout the life cycle. Now that we have the metrics established and how we're going to start looking at team culture and development next, and how leadership are intentionally planned to support project performance. So project leaders plan team culture, development, and leadership to enable sustainable performance and outcomes. So in the PMBOK 8, team culture, development, and leadership are not treated as execution-only terms. Back at PMBOK 6 and a little bit in 7, we kind of looked at team development and leadership as something that more focused on when the project is under execution or when we're actually doing project work. And it's still there, but we've kind of, with PMBOK 8, they've kind of backed this up and looked at, well, how does this impact the resources overall? And so they brought this into the resources domain, which emphasizes the need to plan how resources, including people, will be in human resources, will be enabled to perform efficiently or effectively. So from a planning perspective, this means that we don't need to wait until execution to think about how teams are going to work together. So that was kind of the idea before, was that, well, we get the team together and then we figure out how to make them work together. But this idea is, well, let's try to anticipate that. And so these planning activities establish how we're going to structure the team. Is it going to be a scrum team or a traditional matrix organization? Is it a projectized team? We need to make those decisions ahead of time. And how the leadership is going to be applied. Is it going to be a sort of a self-organized or self-managed team, or is it going to be more of a traditional functional environment? What cultural norms will guide the behavior? What are we good at? I worked on a lot of these digital transition projects where they're trying to transition from a sort of a more functional environment to a more agile or adaptive environment. And some teams are so culturally entrenched in their way of working that it's difficult to shift it. And so we have to take into account that when we do these plans, especially if we're going to be trying to bring methodologies into the organization that maybe they're not accustomed to. And it helps, this helps us guide the planning team culture. This involves intentionally defining expectations related to communication, collaboration, and trust and accountability. And we see this in some of the adaptive models more, where they talk about, trust the team to get the work done, and how the face-to-face communication is preferred, collaboration over, plan contracts. They kind of more explicitly stated out in those models, but we have those values here: to be a good steward, to be a good team member, to have trust, those principles. So planning team development includes anticipating what skill levels we're going to need, understanding and clarifying the project roles, determining what levels of support and oversight is needed based on the maturity of the team and the project complexity. Planning for leadership involves selecting and tailoring sort of leadership styles. Are we going to need to be more directive, more facilitative, or more of a servant style? Sometimes it's largely based on the approach, but it's also based on team maturity and the complexity of the project. And so based on the context and stakeholder expectation as well, we're going to need to figure out which one of those are. And so like if a team is new, you're probably going to need to apply more of a sort of a directive, even in an adaptive model. You want to do that. So you're going to need to figure out how that's going to work. And so this planning, we're kind of anticipate that here. So by addressing these things up front during planning, we can increase the likelihood that the right people with the right capabilities and the right working environment will be available when the project work begins. And so this is a proactive approach that supports performance. And the idea is to reduce friction during execution among team members and aligns resources with delivery objectives. And you notice I mentioned here, and the PMBOK mentions this, that reducing friction, we're not talking about conflict. We don't want to eliminate conflict. We want a certain level of what I call productive conflict. And so we want to create an environment that kind of exploits that as well. That's where in my experience, where the most creative ideas come from. Planning team culture and leadership enables high-performing teams and effective resource utilization. And so the PMBOK 8 here evaluates the resource performance domain based on outcomes, not just simply on whether activities are performed. So when the team culture and development and leadership are planned effectively, we can several observable outcomes emerge. And so these include shared ownership of the project, trust, collaboration among team members, adaptability in changing conditions, and resilience when challenges arise. So effective planning here supports employee well-being by anticipating workload, engagement, and capacity, helps to mitigate burnout, disengagement, and productivity loss. Resource planning decisions interact directly with each other and other performance domains. Resource availability and utilization affect our schedule feasibility, our cost control, risk exposure, scope delivery, and quality conditions in PMBOK 8. And in 7, we have the performance domains that are interdependent and need to be planned together, not just in isolation. Planning of leadership and team practices, therefore, can serve as enablers of value delivery. We want to make sure that the human resources are not only available, but people are productive and that they're engaged and aligned with the project objectives throughout the life cycle. So we want to plan for that now. And so the resources performance domain integrates planning, execution, and control to enable effective use of project resources. So the resources performance domain focuses on making sure that the right resources, the right physical and virtual resources are available, and that everything that they're capable and they're utilized effectively to support our objectives. This domain is not just limited to execution activities, but it integrates planning, execution, and monitoring across the project lifecycle. So this performance domain, here we're talking about the resources performance domain, and specifically we're talking about the planning part of it. But there's also the monitoring controlling part of this, where the usage and performance are assessed against what we planned. So in planning, we're trying to anticipate what we're going to need to during the monitor controlling focus area to get this stuff done. So from a planning perspective, this structure is going to reinforce an important idea that execution effectiveness depends on planning quality, so the quality of our planning. So poor resource planning leads to issues with availability, burnout, inefficiencies, schedule costs, and impact later on in the project. What we're going to focus on here is remaining in the planning resources within the resources performance domain. And so specifically on the plan resource management and estimate resources. So we'll be talking about those two processes next. Those are the two processes that are in this planning focus area of the resource performance domain. And so these processes lay the foundation for effective leadership, collaboration, and performance once the project work begins. Plan resource management establishes how project resources will be estimated, acquired, led, and utilized. The graphic on the screen here shows the plan resource management process, and it's first in the planning process in the resources performance domain. Its primary purpose is not to assign people or acquire assets, but it's to establish the approach and level of effort required to manage the project resources effectively. So from a planning perspective, we're going to define how resources will be estimated, how we're going to acquire these resources, how we're going to lead resources, and how resources are going to be utilized based on the type, size, and complexity and uncertainty of the project. So rather than assuming a one-size-fits-all approach, we, in the sort of newer modern thinking, emphasizes that tailoring resource management strategies to fit the context of the project. The planning process requires anticipating resource availability and resource constraints. So we want to consider the competition that we're going to see for scarce resources and across the organization, and what decisions are made. The decisions that we make here are going to influence later decisions on scheduling, cost estimation, risk exposure, and overall performance. And so, importantly, plan resource management sets expectations again before execution begins. It establishes how we're going to apply leadership, how responsibilities are going to be assigned, how team norms may be defined, and how sort of resource-related risk will be addressed. And so all these decisions help to form the foundation for effective execution. So you see here, we're kind of proactively setting up the project for more success when we do execution. We want things to flow smoother when execution begins. Plan resource management transforms planning information into a tailored approach for managing project resource. And so this slide shows the inputs, the tools, techniques, and outputs for the plan resource management process. And as I mentioned, there's a resource planning part of this that's in the process groups, a practice guide that you'll see in the reading, and it has this process group, this process listed like this. And so this is sort of a visual model that the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs that PMI uses a lot. But so rather than treating this as sort of a checklist, it's more useful to think of planning as an information flow. So the inputs represent the information that's already available from earlier planning efforts or concurrent planning efforts, such as the project charter, the scope baseline, the schedule if if that's going on, the risk register, stakeholder information. All these inputs provide context that's needed to make inform planning decisions. And so the tools and techniques support analysis and tailoring. And so things like expert judgment, data gathering, organizational theory, and the project's complexity, uncertainty, all these things lead to how we're going to apply the tools and techniques. And then the outputs formalize these decisions so that we have a good resource management plan and a team charter document that will allow us, it documents how the resources are going to be managed and how they're going to be defined. So these outputs enable consistency, transparency, and alignment before execution begins. Effective resource planning depends on integrating existing project and organizational information. So the inputs kind of covered this already a little bit, but they provide information and foundation for determining how resources should be managed. And so the inputs don't prescribe any specific assignments, but they help shape decisions that we're going to make during this. So the project charter, to kind of focus in a little bit, establishes the project's purpose, objectives, and success criteria, if you remember that from the prior sentence. So from a planning standpoint, it signals the level of leadership involvement, governance, and organizational support to enable the project team, enable the project to go. Then there's the project management plan. And remember, that's a compilation of several different planning artifacts. And particularly here, we're interested in the scope and quality components that clarify how the work must be performed to meet those standards. And it helps us to determine what type of skills and dependencies and capacity needed that we're going to need to support the value delivery. Project documents here are things that provide operational context. So the schedule that highlights the timing, the sequencing of constraints that affect resource availability. Requirements documentation clarifies work expectations. The risk register helps to identify potential resource risk, such as skill gaps or dependency on scarce resources. The stakeholder register informs collaboration, communication, and leadership in planning. And then enterprise environmental factors reflect internal conditions such as organizational culture, sort of maybe the labor market availability, regulatory requirements, geographic distribution of teams, available collaboration technologies, all of these kind of factors that influence how we can realistically acquire resources, manage, and support those. Organizational process assets here include sort of maybe the internal politics of the organization, templates, historical data, lessons learned information, retrospective information. All these assets help us to align resource planning with organizational standards and apply proven practices that come from learned from past projects. So together, all these inputs ensure that resource management planning is context aware, realistic, and aligned with both project objectives and our organization's expectations before we enter into the execution of the project. So planning tools, the tools and techniques here, planning tools and techniques enable project leaders to tailor how resources will be managed. So tools and techniques used in the plan resource management process support the main primary objective of tailoring the resource management approach to the project context. They're not execution tools here, they're planning aids that help us to make informed decisions about how our resources are going to be managed, supported, and led. So expert judgment, we've talked about this before, but it's used here to interpret project characteristics such as complexity, uncertainty, organizational culture, stakeholder expectations, project content, and it helps us determine what level of formality, leadership involvement, and governance that's needed in the project. Data gathering techniques here are such as interviews are used to identify assumptions, constraints, and expectations that are related to resource availability, team composition, organizational support. All these conversations help us understand, uncover the dependencies early in the planning process. And then data analysis techniques, including SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats analysis, allow us to assess the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats that are related to the people and other like physical resources. So this analysis, this SWOT analysis supports predictive planning of for skill gaps, for capacity constraints, and reliance on scarce resources. Data representation tools such as hierarchical charts. So we have the WBS from before, but hierarchical charts and responsibility assignment matrix. So we haven't talked about it yet, but it's a RACI assignment matrix that is based on responsible, accountable, contribute, inform role of project resources that helps us to visualize these roles and understand the reporting relationships and accountability. And so they help improve clarity and reduce ambiguity from the project. And so organizational theory here is sort of the resource-based view or the human resource management views help us here to provide strategic perspective. So it's a contingency base, it's an agile base. How are we going to structure our teams? How are we going to keep them motivated? And so we pull out of those theories to help us create these decision parameters in this part, applying these tools and techniques. So they support, what we're trying to do is support the long-term capability and development of efficient resource utilization and alignment with organizational values. And so we can take all these things together to design a management approach that is realistic, context aware, and aligned with the value objectives. And so the outputs of this process, the plan resource management outputs, define how resources and teams will be enabled to perform in the project. The outputs here is the plan resource management, is the planning decisions that's going to define how resources will be managed throughout the project. And we've got two, well, there's several here, but the main one is the project management plan and the team charter. And so these outputs are not about assigning people or acquiring resources. They help establish the rules and expectations and structure to guide all these activities during execution. So the resource management plan is the primary output. It describes how resources are going to be estimated, how we're going to acquire resources, how we're going to develop the resources, how we're going to manage the resources, and how we're going to control these resources from a project management perspective. And so, but from a planning perspective, this plan clarifies the leadership approaches and it clarifies the roles and responsibilities in all these assumptions that we make about resource availability, about responsibility, it's going to define those here, document those here. And it's also going to define the strategies that we're going to use for addressing constraints or conflict. And it ensures that the decisions we make about the resources are intentional and that they're aligned with the project's objectives. The team charter establishes expectations for how the project team is going to work together. So it's going to define these norms and collaborations. In adaptive projects, sometimes this is called a team working agreements. And it can be it charters the same thing, but we can help create this during planning, and then as the teams are formed, they can customize this in working agreements to meet their sort of on what the reality is at the time. So creating this during planning helps us shape that culture in the beginning. Then we've got project management plan updates. These are updates that ensure consistency across the areas. So as resource management decisions are made, we need to update the components of the project management plan, like schedules or cost considerations that need to be made or documented to refine assumptions that we made in those areas, to maybe refine resource assumptions. And then the document updates here, we need to include things like updating things like the assessment assumption log, risk register, anything that we can do to capture insights during the planning that can help us later on. So for example, assumptions about skill availability. We're going to have the skills available. A lot of times on projects, maybe you have a certain person that's assigned to another project, and we need to make assumption that they're going to be available when our project is started. Things like that. We want to document those here. We want to identify any resource risks. Maybe they're not going to be, maybe that project is running behind schedule. Update those. So we document those here, update those documents. So what we want to create is a good planning foundation that enables us to apply leadership, to coordinate performance once the project work begins. And so here again, we'll go focus on this is sort of some of the things that the resource management plan defines and how these things work together. So it's sort of an idea, the difference between the plan and the team charter. They're both outputs, the resource management process, but they have different but complementary purposes. The resource management plan is primarily a management and government artifact, where the team charter, on the other hand, is a behavioral or cultural artifact. The resource management plan defines how resources are going to be estimated, acquired, and developed, as we've talked about. So it's sort of the how we'll manage resources to support our project objectives, where the team charter establishes sort of shared expectations for how the team's going to work together, how we're going to communicate, how we make decisions, how we're going to be accountable to each other, how we're going to manage conflict. And so it answers sort of how we're going to function as a team. And sort of, as I mentioned, an adaptive project, this is usually extended into team working agreements. So these outputs ensure that sort of the structural and human aspects of resource planning are addressed and provide clarity around management and control, and supports collaboration and trust and sustained performance. That is the resource planning process. Now we need to estimate resources. Estimate resources determines the type and quality of resources required to complete project work, and it focuses on identifying the type and quantity of resources required to complete project work. And this includes people, equipment, materials, facilities, and other assets that we're going to need to deliver the project scope. And so from a planning perspective, this process builds directly on other planning efforts. So it's important to know that what we're talking about here in terms of resources, this process aligns and integrates with a lot of other things. And so the estimating techniques that we use here are going to be applied across many different areas. And so we'll kind of drill a little bit deep into the estimating techniques here. But from a planning perspective, this estimate resources builds directly on these earlier planning efforts. So like scope definition clarifies what work's going to be performed. The resource management plan establishes how it's going to be done. So the estimate resources answers sort of the next question, is what resources are actually required to perform the project work. And so like the main inputs here are things from the scope planning in this part. So accurate resource estimates support realistic scheduling and cost estimation. Underestimating resources can lead to schedule delays, cost overrun, team burnout, while overestimating resources can result in inefficiencies and wasted capacity. So this process plays a key role in reducing uncertainty and enabling informed decisions. In PMBOK 8, we evaluate this process based on how well the resource estimates support feasibility and alignment with value delivery, not whether these estimates were created, not just simply that we created these estimates. As I said before, sometimes the focus in earlier versions of project management, in just earlier domain, we kind of focused on these things. Well, we're busy doing stuff, but are we actually really creating value? And so we measure the impact of this based on whether or not it's actually effective. Resource estimates and schedule development inform and refine each other during project planning. So it's important to note here that in planning, estimating resources and developing the schedule are not independent activities. And so we'll talk about schedule development next, but typically these things are done together. And instead, they're iterative and interdependent. And so a lot of the inputs to the estimate resources originate from the schedule planning elements. But as I mentioned before, when we're trying to discuss these things in a classroom, they tend to be we have to kind of deliver them sequentially, but in reality, we'll be doing these currently. From a planning perspective, activity definitions, sequencing, and duration estimates all influence the types and quantities of resources that are required. And so we'll talk about those in the scheduling. While at the same time, scheduling has to be concerned with resource availability, such as limited personnel, shared equipment, constrained skills. All these things directly affect how the schedule can be developed. So in many cases, the schedule needs to be adjusted to reflect these realistic resource constraints. So we'll be doing these things iteratively. This interdependency explains why that we have a significant number of inputs to the estimate resources are schedule-related artifacts, like activity list, activity attributes, and calendars are all schedule-related artifacts. As project planners, we need to refine resource estimates, and we'll need to adjust activity durations and sequencing, and even scope decomposition reveals the need for additional or different resource assumptions. So again, they're interrelated. We need to emphasize here that planning is iterative and adaptive. It's not a one-pass process. A lot of the thinking in prior project management was that we did all this planning and then we got the stakeholders to sign off on the scope and the schedule, and it was all just a matter of controlling it. Well, now we view this controlling change or preventing change even. Now we've kind of got this idea that we want to sort of embrace change, and we want to build into our project plans the ability to adapt those plans through good change management as the project in all methods. The adaptive method is more geared towards, as we've mentioned, projects that have uncertain outcomes. So we're having to adapt to change much more frequently than maybe we do in the predictive models. So estimate resources identifies the type and quantity of resources required to complete project work. So this process focuses on determining the type and quantity of resources required to perform the project activities or task. This includes human resources, equipment, materials, facilities, and any other assets that we need to complete the planned work. From a planning perspective, this process builds directly on scope and schedule planning. And so activity definitions, sequencing, establish what work needs to be done, while resource estimation determines whether that work is feasible given organizational constraints and availability. So accurate resource estimates are critical because they directly influence schedule development, cost estimation, and risk exposure. Underestimating resources can lead to unrealistic schedules and burnout. Again, while overestimating can result in inefficiencies and unnecessary cost. And so again, as I mentioned, how well we evaluate this is based on whether or not we've produced the value that we planned on. Estimate resources, integrate scope, schedule, and organizational information to determine feasible resource needs. The scope baseline, which is the scope baseline defines what work must be performed, and therefore it establishes sort of a demand for resources. Planning perspective, estimate resources depends heavily on the quality and integration of earlier planning output. Resource estimates are not created in isolation. They're derived from decisions already made about scope, schedule, and risk. So the project management plan provides sort of the governing framework for this. But what we're looking for in that plan is the scope baseline that defines what work must be performed, and therefore it helps establish a demand for resources. Remember, the scope baseline is the scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the work breakdown structure dictionary. And then we've got the schedule management plan, which guides how resources are considered in relation to timing and sequencing and constraints. So that gives us the timing of when we need stuff. And the resource management plan, when available, provides early guidance on resource categories, resource acquisition, and responsibility and assumptions that shape our estimation logic. Project documents here supplies operational details need to estimate resources accurately. So the activity list and activity attributes, they describe the work at a level of granularity sufficient to assess effort and skill requirements and equipment needs. Cost estimates often inform trade-offs between labor, materials, and alternative, like that make or buy decision that we have, analysis that we had earlier in the sourcing domain. Resource calendars help us define availability and working constraints and help us to prevent estimates that assume unlimited or unrealistic access to resources. The assumption log plays a role here in capturing unnecessary related productivity rates and skill availability and learning curves. It gives us assumptions about that. So these assumptions influence the reliability of resource estimates. And so we need to be transparent with these assumptions. And the risk register highlights the threats and opportunities, such as resource shortages or competing priorities or supplier risk that may require contingency or alternative resourcing strategies. The project schedule itself is both an input and a constraint. Resource estimates need to align with activity or task sequencing, dependencies, and plan durations. So in practice, this creates an iterative relationship between estimate resources and develop schedule. So this is where that iterative relationship originates, from the need of these two processes to have this information. And finally, the environmental enterprise factors here are like labor market conditions and things we talked about, and organizational process assets we've already talked about. But together, we're trying to create a feasible, a defensible. So we want to be able to justify this to our stakeholders, and we want it to be aligned with both the plan and the organizational context, rather than just being an optimistic guess of what we're going to create downstream. So now we're an estimate resource process. Resource estimation combines expert insight, analytical techniques, and technology to balance accuracy, feasibility, and uncertainty during planning. Estimate resources, it relies on all these different contexts. From a planning perspective, what we're trying to do here is use these tools and techniques to help us balance the accuracy and feasibility and uncertainty in the project. So expert judgment is foundational to resource estimation. These experts here are subject matter experts. They're functional managers. They're experienced team members, and they can provide us insight into productivity rates, skill requirements. What's the learning curve involved in getting up to speed on what we're trying to do? They can help us out with resource constraints that are not captured in other documents. And this is especially important when it involves new technology or sort of novel work, or we have limited historical data. So maybe it's the first time we've done stuff. Now, estimating techniques here are important. There's basically 3 of them, and they're applied in not only here in resource estimating, but they're applied in schedule estimating, and they're also applied in cost estimating. And so what we talk about here, we'll see again in these other processes. But bottom-up estimating involves estimating resource needs at the activity level or at the task level. and then aggregating them to higher levels with the project. And this approach is usually more accurate, but it requires a more detailed scope definition and more planning effort. And it's usually more seen in predictive or hybrid environments where the work is better defined. Analogous estimating leverages historical information from similar projects to estimate resources quickly. It's less precise than bottom-up estimating, but it's useful in early planning when we don't have a lot of detailed information or it's in development. And the reliability depends heavily on the degree of similarity between past and current projects. And so I see analogous estimating a lot in adaptive models. They call it relative estimating in those projects. So when we create and develop story points, that's analogous estimating. What we're doing in relative estimating and analogous estimating, we're taking something that we understand well, whether we've done it in the past or whether we have the experience. Based on our experience, we're going to apply an estimate based on that to come up with a current estimate. And that's where the inaccuracy, because they're not the same thing, but so there may be some inefficiency there. Parametric estimating uses statistical relationships or formulas such as labor hours per unit or resource per deliverable to calculate estimating. So when we got good data, we can use parametric estimates to offer, they have consistency and scalability across a large repetitive work packages. So like if you go and you hire, you need a new roof on your house, which we just did here, and the roofing company comes out, they're going to measure the roof and they know pretty much down to the, individual or to the hour, how much it's going to, how much effort it takes to put down shingles per square. I think they use a square yard, but you could say square foot, and they can apply that formula to the measurements of my roof, which are unique to my roof, to come up with a good reliable estimate that they can do. You do the same thing at a body shop. You take your car in to get it worked on, or even at a mechanic shop. They know that it's going to, how many hours matter of fact, I just had the power steering replaced in my pickup truck. And they went and looked in their book and said, oh, it's going to take 7 hours to do this, and it's going to require these parts. And they were able to give me a good parametric estimate. In software development, I've seen this used to estimate QA, like testing, but it's less useful in adaptive projects than it might be in more predictive ones. So data analysis here, and it's different than estimating. We do some data analysis like a parametric estimating. It involves data, but here we're looking at alternative analysis. So we're looking at trade-offs between different resource strategies. Teams may need to evaluate whether to use internal staff versus contractors, or automation versus manual labor, or special skills versus generalized skills. And so we need to analyze these things. These have a direct impact on cost and schedule and risk. Then we have the project management information system. These are systems that enable us to model and analyze and document resource estimates using integrated tools such as like scheduling software. So we have tools like Microsoft Project and Primavera, and I don't know, there's Monday.com, Jira, version 1. There's all kinds of these tools out there now. They call them lifecycle management tools, but they allow us to create a place to document these estimates and these decisions that we're making so that we can display them and communicate them in our future planning. So they help improve the traceability and they help support iterative planning. Another big factor here is in all these estimating techniques are meetings and data gathering techniques, interviews, facilitated workshops that help us to validate assumptions. They help us to surface constraints and build a shared understanding around resource needs. And these collaborative techniques help us to build stakeholder support, buy-in, and alignment as well, because we're taking into consideration their needs. And so another thing too to think about is advanced techniques here, such as artificial intelligence, predictive and analytics, simulation models are being used more and more to enhance resource estimation. They can look at patterns, they can forecast demand, they can assess risk scenarios, they can They're especially useful in complex data-rich environments. The overall goal of all these, not to achieve sort of perfect precision, but we want to produce credible, transparent, and actionable resource estimates that are going to help us. They're going to support our scheduling, budgeting, and decisions we make regarding project execution. So, and as I mentioned, the same estimating techniques applied in the estimate resources here are used to estimate project schedules and cost. So these techniques are not owned by a single, or don't live in just one process. They're tools that can be applied across all of these areas, the resource scheduling and cost. So again, analogous estimating is commonly used in early planning when detailed estimation is limited. It allows us to make quick, high-level estimates by comparing current project or activities to similar past effort. And so it's useful across all of these areas, resources, schedule, and cost. But its accuracy is going to depend on how comparable your historical data is. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, that parametric estimating uses statistical relationships or formulas. So when we have reliable data, this technique provides consistency and also gives us a way to scale estimates. It's frequently used in schedule and cost estimation, but it's also useful in estimating resource quantities, especially when we have repetitive or standardized work. Again, bottom-up estimating provides, like I mentioned, the highest level of detail and accuracy in estimating, but it requires that we have well-defined scope and activities, and it's typically applied later in planning, and it's used extensively in all three of these processes when precision is required. So, and then we have, again, expert judgment supports all of these, data analysis techniques support all of these. The takeaway here is that understanding how we estimate in project management is transferable to other domains and other focus areas in the project. And so we need to be able to choose which technique we're going to use to fit the context and not, which fits our planning context, not just because we've done it before, because that's what the methodology requires. The estimate resource outputs define the resource requirements enable project work. Estimate resource processes document the results of the resource estimation decisions that we made, and it serves these outputs are going to serve as critical inputs to subsequent planning activities or concurrent planning activities, such as schedule development and cost estimation. So resource requirements specify the type, the quantity, and the characteristics of the resources needed for each activity or task. This includes the people, equipment, materials, and facilities. The requirements directly influence activity durations, sequencing decisions, and feasibility assessments. Then we want to document the basis of these estimates. What we want to do is we want to be able to explain how we develop our estimates, and we want to document any assumptions or constraints or estimation techniques we use, our confidence levels in these estimates, and any known limitations that we have. So from a planning perspective, this provides transparency that's essential for decision making and risk assessment in the future refinement of the project as it evolves. And then project document updates. Again, there's a theme through here that we're going to continue we're doing these things iteratively or concurrently, and so we're going to be kind of iteratively updating all the project document updates. But we want to ensure that any new insights that we've identified during this resource estimation process are captured and managed. And they might include changes to our assumption log, to a risk register, to our activity attributes, to lessons learned register. And we do this so that we can make sure that these documents maintain alignment throughout the planning process. This is a big problem a lot of times when we're planning. If we don't document these things, we start seeing a gap between what we've assumed earlier and what we're planning on now. And sometimes assumptions that we made, if we don't continually, assumptions and risk and activity attributes, all these things, if we don't constantly keep them current, then we get this big gap and we can make assumptions that we probably shouldn't have made. Later, we'll have to pay for that gap in the project. So what we're looking here is we want to ensure that all of our assumptions are explicit, defensible, and integrated into the overall project planning, which is going to reduce the likelihood of unrealistic schedules, cost overruns, and execution bottlenecks. Okay, it's 5 minutes after. Let's go ahead and pick up. So far we've talked about the estimating, and we talked about the estimating resources. We talked about the team planning for team, and we talked about the metrics. So the final topic for this week is the scheduled performance, schedule development. And so effective schedule planning. So we're talking about this from the planning. And let me pause here for just a second. This is one area where they've made a bit of a change when it comes to the the PMBOK 8. Everything is still there. They've just reorganized it. And so there were six individual processes in this domain. Now what they've done is they've taken 4 of those and collapsed them all into one. And so basically now we have 3. And that one of those is the plan schedule management, and then develop schedule. And then the other one is monitoring control. And so they took those 4 and collapsed them into the develop schedule process. So I'll cover that in here. So we're going to cover the same context. It's just going to be organized a little bit different than what you've seen in the process groups practice guide. The logic that they used, I'll try to point this out, but the logic they used behind it is it's something that we've been saying for a long time, because I would always say you need to do these processes sequentially in order to develop the schedule. Well, now they recognize that needs to be documented that way, and so they've done that, and so that's good. The effective schedule planning establishes how work is sequenced, measured, and adapted to deliver value over time. So this is we're getting into time management. So this domain focuses on how time-based planning supports value delivery, not simply creating a Gantt chart or a backlog. It provides a structured way to communicate expectations, manage dependencies, and assess progress throughout the project lifecycle. Within the planning focus area, schedule-related decisions are made early to establish how work is going to be sequenced, how it's measured, adjusted as things change. So this includes defining the level of detail, the rules for change control, how schedule performance will be monitored and reported, and more importantly, that we keep the schedules flexible, which is a little bit of a different approach than other predictive models have done. We're looking at keeping it flexible. And note they don't go to the full extent saying that it needs to be adaptable. They're saying flexible. Adaptable would be in that line, but it'd be a little more than just flexible. The point is, as uncertainty, risk, and our understanding, our knowledge evolves, we can develop the schedules progressively rather than do a fully defined upfront schedule, especially in adaptive and hybrid environments. So that's where we want to keep them adaptable. So there's sort of a level of adaptability here. In a predictive model, we're probably going to want to plan it out pretty much all the way. In a adaptive, we're probably just going to plan enough work to get going, do the first features that we're working on, and then progressively elaborate what they call backlog refinement in the agile world. So we want to progressively elaborate through backlog refinement and extend the schedule all out. But the concept is the same through both of them. We apply the same techniques. It's simply what we have is we have 2 planning processes that kind of anchor this schedule development. One of them is the plan schedule management, which establishes the governance and the policies and the rules for managing the schedule and developing the schedule. Then we have the develop schedule, which integrates the scope, the resource estimates, the dependencies, and the constraints into a workable schedule model. And so we do all these things together to intentionally remember the whole theme today is and through this whole idea of planning as a strategy is intentionally. We're doing this intentionally, and we're aligning with resource availability, our delivery approach, and our stakeholder expectations. So the plan schedule management defines how the project schedule will be developed, monitored, and controlled. So this process establishes the governance framework for how the project schedule will be planned and managed. So rather than creating dates or timelines here, we're going to define how the scheduling decisions will be made throughout the life cycle. From a planning perspective, this includes, we're going to talk about the level of detail of the schedule. Do we need to be really detailed in defining the scope? Maybe we do. Maybe we have specifications that we have to meet. Maybe we need to define rules for how we can change this. Maybe we need to talk about how we're going to measure when something's, how we're going to report on it. So like when we get into talking about cost management and we talk about controlling or measuring cost, we need to maybe make a decision on when we're going to accrue cost. So maybe we're going to accrue 100% when we start the work, or 150% when we start it and 50% when we finish it, or some allocation in between. Well, we probably need to consider that and how we're going to report and measure our progress so we can apply those to the costs. So all these decisions are influenced by how complex our project is, how much uncertainty there is, what the delivery approach is. So they're going to be different for every project. And so this process, the intent of this process is to support adaptive and iterative planning. Instead of just assuming the schedule can be fully defined, we want to enable the schedule to be adapted or to be flexible enough to integrate change as the schedule goes on. Depending on what level of change is, the schedule needs to be more or less flexible. So the process this process is the foundation for the developed schedule process, where we integrate scope, resources, and dependencies into a workable, what they call a schedule model. So the inputs to this is the project management plan. We talked about that before, but particularly here, we're looking at the scope management plan and the development approach. The scope management plan informs how detailed scheduling needs to be, while the development approach, predictive or hybrid, determines how much of the schedule can be defined up front, like I talked about before. The project charter here gives us the high-level objectives, the milestones, and constraints that shape schedule expectations. Sometimes the charter is going to have in it target dates, time-related success criteria, and maybe how the schedule performance will be measured and reported. Assumption log, again, we're looking at assumptions here related to productivity, availability, sequencing, internal, external dependencies, any kind of assumptions that directly affect decisions about scheduling, flexibility, contingency, control, those things. Environmental enterprise factors here are conditions that we're looking for specifically environmental factors that affect schedule planning, such as the culture, regulatory requirements, norms for the industry, labor agreements, tool availability, all these things that influence our scheduling practices, our reporting cycles, tolerance for change, anything like that. Organizational process assets, again, we're looking for scheduling policies or templates or historical information, lessons learned, any asset that we have that can help ensure consistency with organizational standards, enable planners to apply scheduling practices that have been proven to work. And so the idea here is that we want to create a schedule management plan that reflects the realities of our environment and aligns with our stakeholder expectations and supports this adaptive decision-making rather than rigid date control. The schedule management plan is shaped through expert judgment, analysis, and collaborative decision-making. So here we're looking at the tools and techniques for this process. A big part of this is sort of the human side, what PMI calls the power skills, and that's the expert judgment and the meetings. But expert judgment here is we're going to use these things to set up the governance, right? So we're going to be looking at how we're going to control and approach scheduling and how we're going to adapt scheduling. So we're using expert judgment here, the judgment of experts here, to interpret project complexity and uncertainty in organizational culture and stakeholder expectations. And we want to know the level of detail and tolerance. So we rely on the judgments for that. We've talked about that's one of the outcomes we have. Data analysis here, we want to support our informed governance decisions by evaluating like the level of uncertainty, the delivery approach, and the risk exposure. So we can analyze these things and decide whether the schedule should be predictive, should be adaptive, or hybrid, or how much flexibility should be built in. And I think I mentioned this before. This is where we would decide what approach we take. Meetings, here we're looking at collaboration and alignment between stakeholders. We can help, as I mentioned before, look at shared understandings, but specifically with regard to scheduling, we're looking at expectations around project milestones, about reporting cadence, change threshold, and escalation paths. And we can make sure that the governance decisions are understood and accepted before we start developing the schedule. So we know to stay within the governance boundaries. Good governance gives you enough sort of bandwidth, if you will, to do what you intend to do, but do it in a way that produces a valuable outcome. Too much governance is too much constraint and can lead to things like underestimating and overestimating, or underdevelopment or overdevelopment. And not enough governance leaves things too ambiguous, and so that you can kind of, the project can kind of flail around, if you will, in its decisions. So we want to make sure the project schedule management plan reflects reality, the project realities, and supports adaptive decision makings and promotes time-based planning. So the schedule management plan defines how the project schedule will be developed, monitored, and controlled. So the primary output of the schedule management process is the schedule management plan. Again, we're not looking at dates here. We're not looking at timelines. We're looking at how the schedule is going to be approached and governed. So it establishes things like the level of detail. We talked about units of measure. This would be some of the metrics. We would want to validate those here, make sure they're good. Rules for managing change. Again, we want to emphasize adaptive planning. We want to make sure that we're defining how the schedule will be progressively elaborated as uncertainty increases or decreases throughout the project. The plan should align schedule practices with the delivery approach. So depending on your delivery approach. Schedule management plan defines the key elements that govern how project time is planned and managed. And so it documents how the schedule will be planned, monitored, and controlled throughout the life cycle. So an example provided for one of the breakout assignments had the learning management system. You can have the core elements commonly included in a plan like that. It aligns with the PMBOK, so we want to make sure we're aligning with the work we're doing. The introduction and objectives of the plan clarify the schedule management, why it matters. That's what we would have in the plan. The schedule methodology section includes delivery approach that we're going to do, whether it's adaptive or predictive. And so we need to make sure this is a critical choice. The tools selection identifies the systems we're going to use and maintain and communicate the schedule. So we're going to use Jira project. We're going to use Kanban boards and physical boards. What if our reporting cycle is going to be? Key milestones, time. These are really the only time level things we're looking at here in the schedule management plan is the milestones. What control points that we need to have, roles and responsibilities. Who owns the schedule, who updates it, how we're going to report. And finally, we have monitoring mechanisms to decide how the schedule performance will be measured and managed. And, this is things like status meeting, report cadence, variance analysis, risk monitoring. All of this stuff supports adaptive decision-making by defining how these changes are identified, evaluated, and addressed. So again, that's the project, the plan. Now we're going over to develop scope, develop the schedule. You can see here that there's a lot going on. There's a lot in the develop schedule. Developing schedules can be an entire course in its own. And oftentimes it is a whole separate training area if you're trying to train a team on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go through this and point out the most significant stuff, but we'll talk in enough detail that you walk away with an understanding of how to develop a schedule. But the development schedule integrates scope, resource, and dependencies into a workable schedule model. It focuses on creating a time-based model that represents how and when work will be performed. The schedule management plan, it's different, establishes the rules. We're looking at here the actual workable schedule when we're going to do it. So from a planning perspective, the schedule is not a static timeline or a Gantt chart. It's a dynamic model. So it's going to change, used to test feasibility trade-offs. The schedule helps project leaders understand dependencies, helps them to identify critical paths, and assess how uncertainty, risk, and resource availability is going to affect our delivery. As shown on the screen here, the inputs include a wide range of planning artifacts, activity list, duration estimates, resource requirements, assumptions. All these things collectively define what work must be done and the conditions under which they'll be performed. These inputs ensure that the schedule is grounded in realistic expectations rather than just optimistic assumptions. The tools and techniques represent analytical methods used to transform all of these inputs into that schedule model. Things like sequencing, network analysis, estimation, optimization. All these things allow us to determine in what logical order things need to be in, determine estimate durations, evaluate alternatives, and adjust for constraints. And we want to emphasize here that all these things are applied iteratively, especially in environments where uncertainty is high or where we use an adaptive or hybrid model. The outputs of this process include this project schedule and a schedule baseline, which should provide, and they're kind of the same thing, there's a little bit of difference, which provide a reference point for monitor control. Supporting artifacts such as the scheduled data, calendars, and updated documents ensure that the schedule can be communicated, analyzed, and adjusted. The purpose of this developed schedule process is to ensure that time is planned intentionally in line with the scope and resources, and it's flexible enough to adapt as knowledge increases, even in predictive environments. So again, this is a foundational kind of activity that for effective performance measurement when we get into execution, performance and decision making, if you will. The inputs, the developed schedule it relies on integrated planning inputs to create a realistic schedule model. So the developed schedule process relies on a broad set of planning inputs. And what they do is collectively they define what the work will be, what it will be performed, how long it's going to take, and under what conditions it needs to occur. And they need to make sure the schedule is realistic and traceable and aligned with project constraints. From the project charter, here we're looking at high-level time expectations for major milestones and constraints that shape schedule development. And also the authority to develop the schedule. And we may have external, what they call mandatory dependencies or deadlines that need to be respected throughout the project. We're going to look for those in the project charter. Then we have the project management plan. We're looking here specifically at the scope management plan, which defines how scope is structured, so the work breakdown structure. The schedule management plan that tells us how the rules for developing the schedule and our development approach, whether or not it's predictive, hybrid, or adaptive. Then the project documents here, we're looking here, these project documents provide operational detail, but we're looking at things like the activity list and activity attributes. These things, they identify specific work in relevant details such as constraints or assumptions related to dependencies. We want duration estimates here. We want to define how long activities are expected to take based on available resources, assumption log, what assumptions that affect sequencing or timing, milestone lists, key decision points and milestone targets, delivery targets. Again, our basis of our estimates, we had those from the estimating that came over here. Any lessons learned that we have from prior scheduling that we've done, resource information, what their calendars are, anything that ensure that activities are based on realistic availability rather than just theoretical capacity, project and team assignments, what teams, who's doing what skill levels, risk and external inputs here are the risk register. We haven't talked about this, but risk, we should be documenting risk as we go along in the risk register. So we have these here. Agreements, any kind of contractual agreements, maybe from the sourcing strategy, sequential constraints, anything like that. Enterprise environmental factors here are like tools, systems, regulatory requirements, anything that shape how the schedule is built and maintained. And then organizational process assets provide, here are templates, standards, historical data that are specific to schedule development. So the schedule is only as good as the inputs that we use to build it. You know, the developed schedule doesn't invent time. It helps us to organize known information into a realistic plan is kind of what we're aiming for here. The developed schedule tools and techniques transform planning inputs into a feasible schedule model. So there's different schedule models. So a Gantt chart is one schedule model. A backlog list is another kind of scheduling model. A project roadmap is another scheduling model. A Kanban board is a scheduling model. They're all different. So whatever model the model is going to apply to your particular approach. For this, we're probably going to mostly focus on the tools, the Gantt chart model. The tools and techniques in the develop support different aspects of building realistic models. Some of these things help us sequence work, while others analyze uncertainty and duration. Some optimize schedule under constraints, and others support coordination and decision making. Rather than applying these things individually, we need to select and combine them based on our complexity of the project and our delivery approach. So each tool has a different function and the overall goal of producing a feasible, manageable schedule. Expert judgment here, again, is experience and contextual knowledge that we use when we have incomplete knowledge uncertainty helps us to make informed scheduling decision. Decomposition, we saw that as a tool back in the breakdown the scope statement into work breakdown structure. We'll further break down the work packages into activities so we can estimate durations and we can sequence them and we can apply dependencies. Rolling wave planning allows for detailed near-term planning while leaving future work at higher level. And this is important depending on the type of flexibility built into your model. Precedence diagramming method, PDM. This is the project network that visually maps activities and other dependencies into a logical sequence. So we have these logical relationships, which is next defines how activities are connected, finish to start, end to end, realistic flow. Dependency determination, integration identifies required and discretionary and internal dependencies and enforce those. So we have estimation techniques, same ones that we had applied in the resource estimating. A reserve analysis, this is where we want to have buffers to account for uncertainty and identified risks. So this would be our contingency reserve or our management reserves that we talk about in cost later. Data analysis techniques here evaluate schedules under different assumptions and scenarios. So we do what-if analysis, maybe simulations. So it's like a Monte Carlo where we can change risk and variability. Alternatives analysis, comparing different scheduling options. And then voting, we can vote on this in our meetings. We can vote on whether or not what confidence we have. So it's a group decision-making techniques that we can select different options from. Network analysis, schedule network analysis, where we look at critical path method or critical chain method. Critical path method identifies activities that determine in the project duration. In other words, it's the sequence of activities that have to be completed without any slack or float. In other words, they have to be completed in a specific order. That's going to give us the duration of the project. It's also going to tell us the shortest time we can complete the project. Critical chain accounts for resource constraints. So maybe we need a backhoe at a job site, but that thing is used on another job site and it's constrained until it's released from that. And so we need to we schedule based on critical change. Schedule compression techniques, things like fast tracking. This is where we overlap activities to do work, and crashing is where we just add more resources. Resource optimization, this is where we adjust the activity and timing to resolve resource constraints. And the big optimization technique there is called resource leveling. This is where we address over allocations by shifting work around. So say we have a resource, say we have that backhoe, and we only have it for 2 days, but we've got, say, 40 hours of work to do in that 2 days. Well, we may have to try to access that resource again and spread that work out over several more days. We can look at people that way. Say we have got a 65% utilization on our work. So we're going to only schedule for, say, maybe 6 hours a day of actual project work. The other 2 hours are for other things. But we've got 10 hours of work that needs to be done that way. We need to spread that out. And what that's going to do, that's going to increase the duration of our activity over time. So we're going to take that 10 hours of work that we need to get done in one day and spread it out over, say, 2 days. And now the duration of that, instead of 1 day duration, it's 2 days of duration. And the cool thing about that is a lot of these tools can help us with that, do the calculations on that. Then there's the project management information system. Again, the tools that we're going to use to calculate, update, and maintain the schedule. And then the agile release planning. This is where we have time-based delivery expectation in an adaptive environment. So we have roadmaps and feature deadlines and things like that we want to. So the point of this whole tools and techniques discussion, there's a bunch of them that we use here, and there's no way in this course we could go through them all. You'll learn them as we progress through the courses. Each of these tools supports a specific scheduling function, but none of them is sufficient on their own. So we need to, the effective schedule development comes from selecting the right combination for the context of our project to structure the work, analyze uncertainty, and manage constraints and support collaboration. The result here is not a perfect schedule, but a schedule model that we can test and that we can communicate and that we can adjust as the project evolves. And when we say communicate, we can use it for communication with stakeholders and to further our project outcomes. So we don't need every tool on every project, but we need to understand what each tool is designed and helps us do. The tools kind of have distinct purposes, and I won't spend much time on this, but there are basically 4 categories. One of them is the sequencing and structuring, that we use tools to sequence instruction. We use tools to analyze and estimate. We use tools for optimization and constraint management. And then we use some tools for governance and decision support and enable it. So groupings that we can understand, well, if we're working on sequencing, we probably want to use one or more of those tools. If we're working on, analyzing and estimating, we may want a combination of these tools. So this will help us guide what selection and what tools we do if we can think about them in these groupings, these categories. The principle here is that there's no single best scheduling technique. Effective scheduling development comes from intentionally combining tools based on context and our delivery approach. What is our risk profile? What stakeholder needs? We want a schedule that's achievable, but it's also monitorable. In other words, we can measure it based on the metrics that we establish in planning, and it can be adaptable throughout a project execution. We want to set ourselves up for success here by effectively applying these tools and techniques. Developed schedule produces both a schedule baseline and the supporting artifacts needed for control and that adaptation, like I've talked about. We want a schedule that's adaptable. And the outputs represent the tangible results of integrating scope, resources, durations, and logic into a usable schedule model. They do more than just document dates. They establish the basis for execution, monitor, and control. The project schedule is the primary output. It represents the planned start and finish dates, activity durations, milestones, and sequencing needed to deliver project outcomes. In PMBOK 8, the schedule may take different forms depending on the delivery approach. I mentioned it might be a backlog. It might be a roadmap. It might be a Kanban board. It might be a Gantt chart, ranging from a detailed predictive schedule to time-boxed or release-based schedules in an adaptive hybrid environment. So once approved, the schedule baseline becomes our reference point for performance measurement. The schedule baseline is the agreed upon version of the schedule that is used to compare actual progress and assess variances. So changes to the baseline require change control, some kind of change management strategy, whether it's a formal change control or a iterative adaptive change control, but whatever change control needs to reinforce a good governance practice. So this is where the difference between the schedule and the baseline. The schedule is just the schedule. It's the dates and the time. What we're looking at for the baseline is where we apply the scope over that. And so by looking at a time phase scope delivery is what the baseline is. We can look at particular points and make an assessment. Well, this is where we should be at this given point in the schedule. Now, what the the schedule itself will give us the sort of the timing of the activities, but it doesn't really give us the insight into the scope, the goals or the objectives that we're trying to deliver. The project management plan, the schedule data and schedule calendars here provide detail, supporting detail that helps us to enable the monitoring and execution. So in here we have the assumptions, constraints, any kind of calculated values. Calendars define working and non-working time for resources and activities. The schedule development usually reveals some kind of, usually come up with conflict in feasibility or dates. We may generate change requests here to kind of move things around to adjust scope or resources. This whole sort of putting things together in an achievable schedule will result in change a lot of times. And then so the project management plan updates here are the across the planning act that we need to do, probably the schedule management plan, activity list, activity attributes, duration estimates, milestone list, resource requirements, and risk register. We're looking to make sure that we have a schedule that's a good schedule that's not just a schedule for scheduling purposes, but it's a schedule that can be used, it's valuable, and it can be governed, and it can be communicated, and can be readily applied throughout the project lifecycle. Kind of supports the principle on value delivery and adaptability. Schedule development is an iterative planning cycle that aligns with work definition and estimation to adjust, support continuous improvement. This is where they've taken the define activities, determine sequence, estimate duration, and adjust. They've taken those and put those into this schedule development here. These used to be independent processes on their own that had their own set of inputs, tools, techniques. And so the 4 steps represent the steps that we're going to use to develop a schedule. And it's define activities, sequence activities, estimate effort and duration, and adjust. And as I mentioned in earlier versions of the PMBOK guide, they were listed as individual sequential processes. And we used to always, when we were on a team, we would always say, okay, we got to do this. We do this first, we do this next. And since we're actually doing it, we might as well put them in one process. And so it makes good sense to put them here. It reinforces a step-by-step planning mindset where each process is largely completed before moving on to the next. That's what the prior one did. So this one kind of shifts that perspective, treating it as something we do iteratively internally in development, not a separate thing we do outside of development. And instead of treating them as isolated processes, now we treat them as integrated planning cycle that can be repeated until we get the schedule is, acceptable, until it's a working schedule. This model that they have here, these steps, also align really well with something called the Deming-Schuhart model, PDCA model, which is the plan, do, act, or adjust model. It was created by Edward Deming, and I think the guy's name is Michael Schuhart. I can't think of his first name. Back in the 1920s or so, as a statistical quality control model. Most project management and most even in the agile world have adopted this model as a model for continuous improvement. So if we look at schedule development as we frame it as a continuous improvement activity, what we're trying to do through this process here is to iteratively plan, define activities. We want to do the work, estimating the effort and duration, and then we want to adjust the schedule risks and constraints. And so this change in perspective represents the reality of modern project where we're really kind of progressively elaborating the schedules, and especially with adaptive and hybrid environments. And it's a broader emphasis on, it's no longer about producing a perfect schedule, but it's creating a schedule that can be refined and validated and adjusted. I'm going to just kind of mention each one of these a little bit here, but the define activities, step 1, schedule development begins by defining activities. Step 2, plan do, the plan do part of it, the Schuhart cycle, activities are defined. And here we're looking at the logical sequence of these relationships. And estimate effort and duration kind of speaks for itself, whether or not it's feasible, given, we estimate whether it's feasible given the resources and consumption constraints we have. And then adjust or act. This involves reviewing the draft schedule and making sure necessary adjustments. And so the takeaway here is that these steps reinforce that schedule development is just not a one-time thing. It's something that we need to do continuously throughout the project. It's different than the kind of one and done way we used to think about this stuff. We'll work through this process right quick. Define activities focuses on identifying and documenting the specific work that must be performed to produce the project deliverable. So defining activities translates scope into an actionable work required to build the schedule. So this step takes the approved scope translate it into discrete manageable activities. So here we're applying that decomposition technique, can create activities that we can sequence, we can estimate and track. And so one of the things that I always talk about, I always get is in a work breakdown structure, what is the right level of work package? What should we go? Well, we want to develop the work packages where we can estimate it and assign someone to do it. So now we're taking just a little level, one further more, the level of detail that we need to actually realize that work package. Okay. But we want to leave it intentionally flexible. We don't want to be too specific here, but we want to define them so that we can go through and estimate the duration and the cost of this. And so defining activities is not just a one-time thing. Again, progressive elaboration. The goal here, again, is not precision, but we want sufficiency. We want a sufficient level of clarity to enable sequencing and estimation in the later steps. We want logical sequencing and realistic estimation. We want to enable that. And so by defining activities early, we can establish a shared understanding of the work and reduce risk. We can reduce ambiguous scope and that helps control scope creep and all kinds of things like that. So it's a foundation for schedule development and ongoing control. Step 2, determining sequence establishes logical order, which activities need to be performed. In step 2, we want to focus on identifying and documenting these logical relationships. And what's on the screen here is sort of a typical precedence diagram. You can see that we've got to do activity A in the top one before we can start activity B, but activity B and C can start at the same time, but activity D can't start until activity B is done, and activity E can't start till activity C is done. But this relationship here, this relationship between activity and B creates a sort of a finish start relationship with both of these, but we're not done until, so we could kind of map the critical path if we knew the durations of this. Now this one at the bottom here is just a sequencing of maybe an individual part or individual work package. I haven't been on a project in a while since we actually sequenced the entire project. Microsoft Project will do that for you. These tools will do it for you. But we don't, mostly what we do is we'll take an individual work package or an individual epic or feature and sequence that work. And then that gets built into the schedule. And then that creates the overall project network. But we're still not really talking about dates here. So, once the activities are defined, the project team can determine the order which we need to. So it's about ordering here, the sequencing, and it's about understanding dependencies. We're looking at these dependencies here. What's dependent on what? And this helps us support decision making on when work should get done, how to prioritize work, and what kind of risk there is involved to it. So if we don't understand our dependencies well, this can lead to unrealistic schedule expectations, rework, and what they call hidden delays that we don't anticipate later in the project. So in adaptive and hybrid environments, this can be refined iteratively as the details evolve, but in things like precedence diagramming and logical relationships allow schedules to remain flexible. So we can still apply these things even though we're using different approaches. By clearly sequencing activities, we can create a structural backbone of the schedule that helps us enable accurate estimation and optimization and ongoing monitoring. Step 3, an estimating effort and duration connects resources to time to produce realistic activity timelines. Okay, so that's saying a lot here, but the idea is that the estimate effort and duration focuses on determining how much work is required for each activity and how long that work will take once resources are applied. So that's where that resource leveling comes in that we talked about earlier. And so what they've done here in this is there's an activity A. We have 40 hours in 5 days. We got 80 hours in 10 days, and they've 30 hours of effort and 3 days of duration here that they've estimated. And then we've got, I guess the thing I'm struggling here to kind of speak on too is the effort and duration are not the same thing. Effort represents the total of labor required, the total amount of, how big is it? How big is the bread box, and how much effort is it going to take to build the bread box? While duration represents how much time it's going to take to apply that effort in that. So that's kind of one of the things we're looking at. So PMBOK 8 emphasizes that estimates are context dependent, and techniques such as expert judgment, analogous estimating, and reserve analysis are all used here. And so estimating, again, is an iterative. It improves over time. As the more estimating we do, and the more lessons learned we do, the more retrospectives we do, the better we get at that. Estimating step is where we connect schedule development, the resources performance domain. This is where those two are connected. That we want to reinforce that time planning can't be separated from how people and physical resources are applied. So accurate effort and duration estimates enable realistic sequencing, informed trade-off decisions, and meaningful schedule monitoring later in the project. Adjusting schedule evaluates feasibility and optimizes the plan before execution begins. So in step 4, adjust, we're going to adjust the schedule. This is where we focus on reviewing and refining the draft schedule produced through the sequencing and estimating. So we've got the sequencing, we've got our durations, and they're going to push things around in this schedule model. And we need to figure out when this schedule represents a plan, not a it's a proposed plan. We're not at baseline level yet. That'll be something we do later. So we want to emphasize that adjustment, it's not corrective. We want to adjust now and not do corrective action later on during execution. To reinforce the fact that planning is a discipline. It's something the project team needs to evaluate as they go along, and they want to make sure that the schedule is realistic given resource availability, dependencies, and constraints and risk exposure. So techniques that we're going to apply here are network analysis, critical path analysis, critical chain methods, schedule compression, resource optimization, and applied to test the feasibility and explore alternatives. So this step reflects the check and act stages of the Deming cycle, the improvement cycle. So again, this is where we're looking at improving the schedule. And we want to challenge assumptions. We want to challenge trade-offs. We want to assess trade-offs. We want to assess refinements. We want to make sure that we can do this before we've approved. We want to produce a model here that we can do for a baseline. So again, we're looking at resource conflicts here, and we're going to adjust the schedule. And see, they've taken this and redone it, and they've got a model here that doesn't have this resource conflict here, where we've got A and B both need to work on this resource. So they've moved it up here. They moved D down here to get done to the critical path. So this is a real simple graph, but it kind of drives home that we've got to make these adjustments you can see the flow looks better on this side than it does on this side. Scheduling artifacts are tailored to the delivery approach, planning, balancing plant predictability and adaptability. So at this stage now, the schedule comes together. We've done all of our adjustments, and now we've got a complete workable model. And this slide illustrates how that might look like different delivery approaches. So on the left side, I've got a predictive schedule, which is often created using tools like Microsoft Project. And so the emphasis here is on detailed sequencing, fixed duration, and defined dependencies. And this approach works well when requirements are stable and uncertainty is low. And so on the right, the adaptive roadmap represents a different but equally valid form of schedule planning. So instead of locking in detail at task level dates, the roadmap focuses on outcomes and horizons and incremental delivery, allowing the schedule to evolve as knowledge increases. So what we'll see, and typically we'll see that like in phase 1, we'll have this will be defined in the backlogs pretty well in phase 1. Say phase 1 is the first month of or first quarter of a larger roadmap. Phase 2 and phase 3 will be scoped out in less detail. And as we get closer to these, we'll be doing refinement meetings. The main tool and techniques is meetings here to further elaborate those. Where here we've pretty much elaborated out, and we're going to be, it's mostly a change integration activity during execution. Where here we're integrating change as we go along. The PMI doesn't really, or any of these, we're not really positioning one of the things that's superior to the other. Instead, we want to emphasize that we need to tailor these based on the context, the complexity, and the uncertainty and the stakeholder needs of your individual situation. And so in both cases, the schedule serves the same purpose. We want to communicate expectations, we want to coordinate resources and dependencies, and we want to provide a basis for monitoring, learning, and adjustment of project outcomes throughout execution. It's not about producing a perfect plan, it's about creating a usable, adaptable model that supports informed decision making and sustains value delivery. So it's all part of this, what the course is all about, planning strategy. Planning is a strategy for value delivery, the title of the course. And this is the last slide. So in conclusion, integrated planning enables projects to deliver value in uncertain and dynamic environments. So in today's session, we emphasize that project planning is not about producing isolated documents, but it's about designing an integrated system that supports value delivery. So we examined how project work is intentionally planned to enable outcomes, how metrics are selected to guide decisions, and how team culture, leadership, and resources are planned, not just assumed, to support performance. We've also explored schedule planning as an iterative, adaptive process aligned with the Deming-Short PDCA cycle rather than a one-time linear activity. Whether it's represented as a detailed predictive schedule or a flexible adaptive roadmap, the schedule serves as a decision-making model, not just a timeline. And we talked about how the PMBOK now reinforces effective planning that requires tailoring and selecting the right level of detail, structure, and control based on uncertainty, complexity, and stakeholder needs. And so the key takeaway for today is that strong project outcomes emerge when planning decisions align people, work, time, and measures to value, and when those plans remain flexible enough to evolve as conditions change. So planning sets the condition for success. Project execution reveals the quality of those decisions. So, a lot of times when we get into project management, we really get consumed in doing the work and executing the work, but how well we do that is a factor of how well we've done our planning. Sometimes early on in the agile world, it was like, well, we don't need schedules anymore. We don't need documentation. We don't need all this stuff. But what we found is that we've taken planning and spread it out across the adaptive life cycle. We probably do as much, if not more, planning than we do in a predictive model. So it's just done in a different way and using different artifacts. So that is a big conclusion for today.